All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here at this meeting. This is my first time at this meeting, and I'm really looking forward to coming to all the future ones. This has been really fantastic. Good? Okay. I'm really excited to talk about some of the work that I've been doing over the last 10 years or so on this really charismatic, beautiful, amazing group of animals that we call the Bahamas Boas. This is a pretty personal pursuit for me. I saw my first Bahamas Boa when I was 8 years old on Eleuthera being eaten by a cat. And that really struck a nerve, I think, deep down. But I remember coming home and trying to find out more information about the boas in this region and not being able to turn up much. And I just sort of thought, wouldn't it be neat to one day study these animals and sort of provide that information and also do something about those cats, maybe. So here I am. And so a couple of recent affiliations. I was at UMass previously. I spent the last few years at Harvard University, which is where I did a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about today. But I just started a new position at UNC Asheville in North Carolina. So boas are almost circumglobally distributed. But something that's not really appreciated is the amount of diversity that we have here in the Caribbean region. So 12 species of what we call West Indian boas. Fantastic diversity. Some huge species like the 4-meter-long Cuban boa. Some really tiny species in Hispaniola, less than a meter full grown, very skinny. So really this fantastic radiation of boas started around in the Miocene in the Caribbean. And here in the Bahamas we have some pretty spectacular representatives. So 3 currently recognized species. We have the Turks and Caicos boa. This is one example. It's also known as the southern Bahamas boa. Occurs on a variety of the banks in the southern Bahamas and Turks and Caicos. The Bahamas boa, and then the northern Bahamas boa. So I'll just give you a brief overview of some of these species as we start talking about some of the conservation issues surrounding them. So the Great Bahamas Bank supports the species known as the Great Bahamas boa, or the Bahamas boa. And this is a species that's comprised of a few subspecies. There's some really interesting color pattern variations that occur across the Great Bahamas Bank. And so I'll show you a few examples of these. This one right here, these are 2 individuals. This is an individual, a juvenile from Long Island. You can see it has this really nice kind of reddish coloration if it shows up on the screen. And this is an individual from here on New Providence. One of the important things was that all 3 of these recognized species are now considered to be endemic species to the Bahamas and Turks and Caicos. And this wasn't always the case. Before we started working on this group, this particular species, the Bahamas boa, was considered to be conspecific, or the same species, as one of the boas in Hispaniola. And so by collecting some genetic data, we were able to ascertain that the Bahamas boa is actually a distinct and endemic species to the Great Bahamas Bank. So that was one of the early stages of our work to demonstrate that. So we have 3 recognized endemic species. And this subspecies here occurs on, sorry, I got to get used to this distance, occurs on the sort of eastern end of the Great Bahamas Bank. The Bimini boa is another fantastic color pattern variation that's recognized as a subspecies. Really beautiful, dark, almost jet black in some cases, very striking coloration. And it's only recognized from the Bimini group. Another one is the Andros boa. This one is found on the island of Andros as well as the Berry Islands. These are all subspecies of the Bahamas boa. The Cat Island boa is found on Cat Island exclusively. Really beautiful coloration. You can see that it's quite distinct. Very striking, sort of light stone gray color. And then the Ragged Island boa. I've been to Ragged Island recently as well, and I've yet to turn up a live one. In fact, this is how I find them. Can you see what this is? This is a squished Ragged Island boa on the road. So if you haven't been to Ragged Island, it's incredibly beautiful. But there's this very large, I believe it's a dredging project going on, and there's this really nice, fairly new paved road that connects Duncantown to the sort of northern end of Ragged Island. And there's a lot of traffic on that road now. And so this is unfortunately a not too uncommon situation to find the animals in this way. But I'm going to keep going back till I turn up a live one. We are able to get DNA from this, though, so that's useful. Up on the Little Bahamas Bank, we have the endemic species, the northern Bahamas Boa, mostly found on Abaco Island and a few of the satellites. There's thought to be a small population on the eastern end of Grand Bahama, but that's not been confirmed recently. This is a juvenile. They undergo what's called ontogenetic color change, and it's really striking. So the juveniles are this very beautiful orange color, and as they grow up, they sort of lose that orange and fade to this really contrasting pattern of gray and black spots. And the southern Bahamas banks support what's known as the southern Bahamas Boa. This includes banks in the southern Bahamas as well as the Turks and Caicos banks. And this boa has two morphs, striped and a spotted morph. But it's actually far more complicated than that. We're finding boas of all different colors in the Turks and Caicos, including orange and red, and variations on that. So really actually a lot of color variation within just that within one population on the Caicos Bank. So if we look sort of at the distribution of these three endemic species across the Bahamas and Turks and Caicos, many of these areas I've been able to go to look for boas and to do sampling. And so over the last couple years at Harvard, I was able to basically do terrestrial reptile surveys from Caysal Bank all the way across, Ragged Island up to the northern Bahamas Bank. So I've been able to get to many, many islands in the region looking for reptiles and boas in particular. So I have lots of samples now, lots of data, and I've gotten a lot of help from folks here as well on this project. So one of the interesting things is that when you go and look for reptiles or anything else in remote places, you sometimes turn up interesting things. Oops, here's some pictures of this. One of the things that really sets up this next part of the story was this quote from a paper about the description of the northern Bahamas boa in 1944 by Netting and Goyne. And what they say is that subsequent collecting in the Bahamas will yield additional herpetological novelties and possibly even other representatives of Epicrates. And that was the previous genus name for these boas. That was a long time ago, 72 years ago, this was said. And in the meantime, nothing's quite come of this until last year. We discovered a new species of boa in the Bahamas. And not just any old boa species. These are beautiful, beautiful creatures. And they were essentially completely unknown. A very small population. And so we've named it the silver boa, and I think you'll be able to see why. There's actually two reasons. One is for the coloration, which is very silvery, and the other is the very first individual was in a silver palm, a Coccothrinax. So that seemed a very appropriate name for this new species. Here's a picture of the whole animal. That picture's a little blurry. You talk about a beautiful creature. We didn't know these were there until July of last year. So, all of a sudden, things have got a lot more interesting in the world of Bahamian herpetology. So this has been a very exciting thing that we've been working hard to sort of characterize this new species. I've been down to this population 3 times. I just got back from the last trip last week. We've taken genetic samples. We've encountered 33 individuals now. We've been marking them with permanent tags. We're taking data. We're looking at all the genetics in relation to the other boas in the West Indies. And I can't tell you how excited we are about this. But it's a little bit of a double-edged sword because, we found this new species that wasn't known. And we're faced with this simultaneous excitement, but also a little bit of distress. Based on the work that we've been doing, we think that there might be only a few hundred of these animals left. And so we've found this new species sort of as it's declining, as it's really actually progressing towards extinction. And luckily, we've found it before it's gone. So now the question is, what do we do about this? How can we intervene rapidly such that these animals aren't gone as soon as we find them? So that's a project that we're working on right now, and the National Trust is helping out with that. So we're in the midst of that. But it's a fairly serious situation. So now we have 4 endemic species of boas in the Bahamas. And so Just a really fantastic situation. So if we sort of think about some of the conservation activities that need to occur and we're currently working on, the first is a basic understanding of the biology of these animals. So that's where I come in. My lab uses a combination of laboratory genetic, field work, and computational techniques to get at the sort of relationships within these boas, as well as the natural history, the ecology, the biology. We're trying to work all of that out. And we have over a dozen publications now describing boas within this region. Conservation genetics, that's a project that we're working on quite a bit right now. But then the last two parts are sort of where we take this data that we're generating as academic scientists and sort of disseminate that or pass that information on, not only to the general public so they can get excited about it, but also to conservation professionals, folks who can actually help us implement some of these, some actionable conservation for these species. So, understanding basic biology, what I mean is, can we characterize the distribution? Well, for starters, can we characterize how many species there are, for crying out loud? Right now we've got 4. Hopefully, maybe there's more out there. I don't know. We'll keep looking. The distribution, where do they occur? What's their abundance? What are the threats that they face? So we're in the process of characterizing these different things. And so some well-known threats include introduced predators, the cats, coming back to my first experience with these boas. Cats are really devastating predators for the boas. The islands that have cats, the boas are much less abundant. I'll give you an example. We have one research population in the Turks and Caicos, and we can go out in a single night and find almost 30 boas within a few hours of searching, which if anybody has been looking for boas before, it's extremely difficult to turn up these animals. So finding 30 within a few hours is exceptional. In fact, that's one of the most dense populations of boas that's been discovered. There's no cats on that island. There's no rats. There's no vertebrate predators that have been introduced to that island. It's still very much ecologically intact. We can contrast that to, say, Long Island, where we've gone for almost 2 weeks searching for boas and not turned up a single one. There are plenty of boas on Long Island, but they're much less dense. There's just a whole host of predators and various reasons for that. So that's a pretty major threat for these species. Human persecution. So as I mentioned, let's give an example of the Ragged Islands, but that's not by any means exclusive to that island. The animals are getting hit on the road now, but anytime an animal makes it into Duncantown, say, and encounters a human, that encounter usually ends with the snake being killed. And so that's something that we're really hoping to change is sort of, where do we start? We've had this discussion with the National Trust of, how do we go about launching an education campaign to say, these are national treasures. They're endemic species. They're beautiful animals. They control invasive things like rats. So trying to get that conversation started about getting that message out there. Habitat loss being another example. The Bimini boa is a really fantastic example of the color morph that occurs. And as you know, on Bimini, there's quite a bit of development going on right now. And so we're concerned about, what are going to be the effects of that? I flew over Bimini last night, and it's just, when you fly over, you're really struck by how small it is. And that subspecies of boa is just found on that one little group of islands. Additional threats. This is something that we're working on now is, what are some other things that we can identify that are causing declines within these populations? And one that we've hit on recently is road mortality. And this is something I've been working on along with Sean Geary, is quantifying road mortality in the northern Bahamas Boa. This came about because in our work on Abaco Island, driving around, we see dead boas, or sometimes boas that have just been hit by a car and in our process of dying, and we pick them up and euthanize them because we can't watch them suffer. Turns out a lot of them are getting hit on these roads. So we set about doing, trying to quantify this. This is not something that you'll find in the literature regarding conservation of Caribbean reptiles. It's sort of lumped in with the whole human disturbance umbrella. But I think it's important to sort of parse out what are those actual processes that are contributing to mortality. So we have this project now that we've gotten some good estimates, and I say good in that we're gathering data. It's not good in terms of what the message is, which is that in one of these, really the majorly significant population of the species that we've identified thus far, as many as 1.6 boas per week are being killed by cars alone. And this is across all age classes, adult females, males, juveniles, this is a pretty significant mortality in a fairly small population. In other species of snakes, it's been shown that this type of mortality can lead to the extirpation or the loss of that population just by car strikes alone. So we're really hoping to gather more data and sort of get this message out here. We might do some signage projects or something like that to try to do something to reduce the mortality due to roads. Other issues that we've identified, this is a boa from Cat Island. Can you see what's happened here? This is an animal that was lucky enough to survive, but it's been burned pretty severely. So fires, other types of disturbances can really negatively impact these species. So we're trying to document cases like this. And again, the whole idea is let's document mortality. What is causing these animals to die? And can we quantify it? Conservation genetics. So this is, again, my lab is working on this project. After 10 years of work, we now have a comprehensive genetic database for all the West Indian boas. And what I mean by that is we have samples from multiple populations for all the species. So you have this really nice reference data set. So when we do things like find a new species, we can pretty quickly compare it to the existing data set and figure out where it fits in within the larger phylogeny and relationships among these boas. So we've published on this quite a bit. And now we're sort of winnowing it down, focusing on questions. For instance, we have all these subspecies of the Bahamas Boa on the Great Bahamas Bank. We want to know something about their relationships. We have these different color patterns. They occur on different islands. But how different are they actually? So we're in the process of collecting the samples and generating the data to get at that question, how different these subspecies are. Here's one example. So what we're finding is that there is a huge amount of between-species divergence, but not so much within-species divergence. Okay, so within a species of Bahamas Boa, even ones that are widely distributed, like the Great Bahamas Boa, not as much genetic divergence or genetic diversity as we might have expected. We're hoping to increase the resolution with increased sampling. Another example, the new species, argentum, the silver boa. Very large divergence between argentum and any other species of boa. In other words, they've been separated, we've estimated, for almost 2 million years. But within the species of argentum, the samples that we've gathered, we found 0 genetic diversity. So that's not unexpected, given that we think that it's such a small population, that a lot of, even if we sample many of the animals within that species, we're not finding any genetic variation at all. So we're not quite sure what the consequences of that might be or how that might play into our conservation framework. Right now, it's more going to be focused on, can we make sure that these animals aren't going to disappear on us? So conservation genetics. Passing information on, we've done a lot more of this in the Turks and Caicos just because I've been working there much longer. But trying to get this information out, whether it's on TV or in newspapers, giving interviews, that sort of thing. So this is something that we're hoping to really get going here. I'm really enjoying working with the National Trust and with our DASTRA and some other groups to try to think about ways that we can engage in this here in the Bahamas. And that falls into this working with conservation professionals as well. So one thing that we've done is, we need to have some sort of information about what is the conservation status of these species. So we participated, Sandy Buckner and I participated in an IUCN Red List workshop last summer, where we basically did assessments of the IUCN Red List status for the Bahamian Boas. And one of the problems that we ran into is that we just don't have enough data to really get at a really accurate assessment. So these assessments that we did they're preliminary and they're conservative because we don't know the sources of mortality, we don't know population sizes, and in some cases we don't even know the full extent of the distribution of these species. So again, that's where that basic science is coming into play, and island hopping around the Bahamas trying to find these animals. But we've assessed the northern Bahamas boa as being vulnerable, and it's probably worse than that. The Great Bahamas Bank boa is least concern. That's mostly because it's distributed over a very wide area, and we don't have very good data about the abundance in these different populations on these different islands. Nor do we have a good idea about that, actually how much divergence there is within that species. And then the southern Bahamas boa we've listed as near threatened. That's probably a generous designation. They're probably threatened, if not worse. We have almost no data for inagua or crooked acklins, and I'm not sure that anybody's seen a boa and crooked acklins in years, but if you have, please tell me. But the intention is to go and look very hard there. So, get more data. Most of our data for that species comes from the Turks and Caicos. And then the silver boa, critically endangered. A few hundred individuals left is what we estimate. So with that, there's lots and lots of thank yous, and I'm sorry if I've left anybody out, but the Best Commission, Department of Agriculture have been a great help with permits. It's been a great pleasure to work with the National Trust, with our DASTRA, and with other folks on this project. And so I really appreciate all the help, and I look forward to many more years of catching boas. Thanks.